What's up, YouTube, and welcome to a new episode of the Good Old Podcast. But before we hear from Brian Stevens, the new offensive line commitment that committed to the Cavaliers last week as a grad transfer from Dayton, why don't you go ahead and subscribe to this YouTube channel, click on this video, and then click the bell so that you're notified whenever there are new videos on this channel. And if you're listening to this also on any of the podcast streaming services, why don't you go ahead and subscribe there and leave us a review on Apple and on Spotify so that we can continue to grow this podcast. But for now, let's take a quick break and get this started. Hello and welcome to a new episode of the Good Old Podcast. I'm Jacquie Franciulli for Wahoos 24/7. As you can see, I'm joined by a special guest, new offensive line commit, Brian Stevens. Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jackie.
You know, is it surreal that you went through two recruiting processes like the way you did? You committed to Virginia as a transfer. How different was it this go around for you?
Well, ultimately, time is kind of limited. So I know ultimately, rather making a decision, closer to May, but ultimately, those guys that are all mid-year guys. So ultimately, I kind of had a lot more time than, those guys did to kind of, feel out a lot of other programs and, kind of who was about it and stuff like that. But, it's a lot quicker, a lot more hectic because everything kind of slammed into, smaller window time versus high school. You got almost 3 years of kind of building connections with, coaches from kind of sophomore to senior year and, that sort of deal. So it's definitely was a different process, but, ultimately kind of, what you're looking for, kind of when you know the ropes, what, whether it be strength staff, coaches, kind of other stuff after football, kind of that sort of deal. So you got a better understanding of, those kind of questions though, too. So.
And you officially visited Virginia a couple weeks ago. And I think about 10 days or a little less than 10 days later, you decided to commit to Virginia. What was the reason behind that decision that you wanted to say, this is the moment that I want to decide?
So I was ultimately on spring break before heading to Virginia. So kind of, going there, had a great visit. Ultimately kind of in the my recruiting process, kind of had slowed and, that kind of stuff. And ultimately, I felt good. That was the decision. Family felt good. Everything kind of felt like, at home, kind of similar to what I had at Dayton, my first go around, and kind of said, I think this is the place to, kind of do it at. And ultimately, not only, it helps, myself through the, I know exactly where I'm going, who, build that relationship with better, but also kind of give, the schools that I had been talking to say, hey, this is what I want to do, that kind of deal too. So kind of, two-way street, there as well. So.
Talk a little bit about how that went. Did you make a call to Terry Heffernan to say, yes, I'm committing to you? You called Tony Elliott. Tell me how it all went down.
Yeah, so ultimately, I think I called them. When did I call them? Sunday. So ultimately, kind of had that week of, everything, this is it kind of deal. So I originally, I'd called Coach Terry first. Kind of didn't. I don't think he thought of anything of it, being a week or whatever. And ultimately, I was kind of, oh, how's it going? I didn't start it off like, that sort of deal. And he was jacked up. So, and then I called, Coach Elliott after, and, I think he was thinking I was just, keeping in touch, great visit, stuff like that. And I think they both were really surprised when I was like, yeah, this is what I want to do. And I want to commit to UVA. So they were, they were ecstatic and, anything I needed, stuff like that. So they were totally on board. Cause I think, Coach E was going to Suns baseball game or stuff like that. So he was already pumped up, for that too. So.
And, you mentioned Coach E's son. There's a lot of that family feel around the program. Their family is really involved with much of the football program, as well as, the recruiting. Whenever you go on recruits, you meet their family. How much did that play a role in you? I feel like a lot of guys that I talk to always mention that they love that family feel.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's definitely more comforting than, not having that, I would say. Kind of similar to, what I had been at Dayton, everybody, that big family aspect was a big part of kind of my decision to go there too. So ultimately, whether that just be, freshmen hanging with seniors and, the intermix of all that, but also, kind of learning a lot of what they do, kind of family dinner style, on Wednesdays, and kind of some, different stuff that I had kind of never seen either. They really, that was really something that was, kind of special. And, I don't think you see often in many programs. And, that was pretty cool to see. So it was definitely a comforting feeling. So.
Did you know much about UVA before your visit?
I had known some. So ultimately, I had actually played against Juwan Briggs in high school. So at Walnut Hills, obviously, he had transferred out a few years ago. Was that came back to UC? So obviously, could kind of didn't know of Juwan and stuff like that, but always kind of seeing guys kind of in the same league. But ultimately, Cincinnati's not too far. So obviously, I had heard quite some things about that, but also had a few friends that also, applied and tried to get into school. Ultimately, they went, other routes and stuff like that, but, had a, decent base. Wasn't like it was just kind of, out in nowhere. Like, oh, where's, so.
And you and Terry Heffernan got to bond being Dayton grads. You're soon to be a Dayton grad. He was a Dayton grad. I'm guessing that's an easy bond for you guys to have.
Oh yeah. We've got, Coach Chamberlain, who was my head coach. I think he was the linebackers coach, or he must have almost been the defensive coordinator by the time Coach Heffernan was there. And then ultimately, like I said, Mark Toby, strength coach, we both had, and like our equipment manager, has been the same guy for multiple of years there. So there's a bunch of connections there. They know about Coach Heffernan. They were telling me stories about him, and so that was pretty cool to see too. So.
So when you look at, what you did when you were a Dayton, Pro Football Focus has you as one of the best defensive linemen in the FCS. I think the best defensive guard in FCS after last year. What are your goals coming to Virginia next year? What do you want to accomplish?
Ultimately, my big thing is, I want to be a team guy, and I just want to make the team better. Whether, best five guys are going to start, whether that's, me at, left tackle, me at center, me at guard, I can kind of transition. That was kind of my versatility aspect at Dayton. I was kind of, they kind of threw me where we needed it most, and that's kind of where I fit in. But, ultimately, I was a captain last season on Dayton. I think that was a big part for me where it was more or less my team that I kind of, could take some more control and responsibility. So ultimately, looking to do that at Virginia, and hopefully bring, unite a bunch of guys. But, they seem like they got a bunch of fire and energy, and they're ready to, go win. Ultimately, I've had a burning passion to go win a ring somewhere. So, that's kind of one of my, goals and aspirations. But, ultimately, I think, I wouldn't say all conference or nothing like that. Ultimately, I want to win games, and I want to help this team win. So
I'm guessing Virginia have they told you what position they're looking at you just right now? Just kind of talking to you and seeing your film. Have they said we're looking at guard, or they kind of want to see what happens during fall camp?
I would probably say both. I mean, I think ultimately just because of size wise, I fit more, interior wise, but, ultimately, sometimes things happen, and, things get moved around. So, you never know. So.
And have you had any talking to any of the current defensive linemen on Virginia? Have you already started kind of making those relationships? I believe you spoke to a few of them when you were on your visit too.
Yep. No, so who I had Noah Josie on, that took me around there. So, when he heard I committed and stuff like that, he had reached out and stuff like that, and was happy. So no, but ultimately, hope to hear from more of those guys, and hopefully maybe getting some meeting rooms with them, so I can meet the whole O line room, and offense at that point too. So.
And actually, you brought up Noah Josie, and this is a good segue to what do you like to eat? I know all offensive linemen are great foodies, and Noah Josie actually had made I think the weirdest mix for a green smoothie I've ever seen. He adds hot sauce to his smoothie, including spinach, almond milk, and it's just a bizarre mix. Do you do anything like that? What is your go-to food item, or do you have anything strange like that? Because I'm sorry, I cannot think of a hot sauce with almond milk in my smoothie.
I'm not a big smoothie guy. But I'm a big probably meat guy. So I like the, whether it be burgers, whether it be like chicken Alfredo, kind of, those are kind of my centerpieces, I would say. I don't think I have anything that's true out of the ordinary, maybe a buffalo chicken Alfredo. That's kind of that would probably be as far as I would go. But
Mhm.
I make that for the roommates all the time, and they go nuts for that. So there's really not much, crazy there, but they're like, oh, I need, exactly what you use and stuff like that. So
So that'll be something for the offensive line potluck, will be your
yeah,
buffalo chicken Alfredo.
yeah,
But if
for sure.
Noah Josie gives you a smoothie, say no.
Okay, good to know. Good to know.
You're graduating from Dayton. What are you graduating? What degree are you graduating with?
So my degree will be health science, concentration, exercise, and movement sciences. So ultimately, kind of coming here, was kind of looking at MBA because ultimately kind of was looking at medical device sales and stuff like that. But ultimately, learning Virginia's MBA program is pretty prestigious and needs some professional work experience. So kind of I'll be looking at towards kinesiology or kind of higher ed and administration. So kind of still working through those, which ones to do, whether year or 2 year program. So.
And my final question is I kind of leave it up to you. What would you like UVA fans to know about who you are and kind of what you're bringing here to Charlottesville?
Ultimately, I would probably say I'm a pretty energetic guy. Ultimately, I'm a big weight room guy. So I'm always the guy screaming at everybody, in the weight room. So ultimately at Dayton, I broke the power clean record at 401. So that was kind of, one of my big accomplishments there. Um, guys are always, in the weight room, that's where you spend most of your time, and that's where I live and thrive. So ultimately, one day probably, possibly open up my own gym, be a certified strength coach. That's kind of where, you know, some of my side goals and, that's where I'm kind of at right now. So,
All right. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining on our podcast today to talk about your commitment to Virginia.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for Brian for joining us on the show. It's always nice to hear from these new players before they reach on ground. So you get to get to know them a little bit and their personalities. So again, thank you so much for Brian. And thank you once again for listening to the podcast. And again, the show is available wherever you listen to your podcast. It's also available on YouTube. And if you can go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as our podcast, wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you can go ahead and leave us a review and rate us on Apple and Spotify, that will all help us to continue to grow this channel and this pod so that we can have more podcasts for you guys as we continue to count down to the next Virginia football season. And we'll be right back here on Thursday as we continue our look into the spring football game, which will be on April 15th. We'll kind of talk a little bit more about what storylines we'll be watching and what position battles we'll be keeping an eye on as April 15 comes closer. So for Brian Stevens, I'm Jacquie Franciulli, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your week.